Hello everyone, and welcome back to London Learning Lean. Next week, we have Oliver Nash, who will tell us about ergodicity and Gallagher's theorem. But this week, we're very pleased to welcome, here I am doing several things at once, Ashvni Narayanan, who's going to tell us about p-adic measure theory in Lean. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk. So I've given part of this talk before last year, in fact, where I spoke about defining the p-adic function. I don't know if I had the definition ready then, but I do now, and I also have some properties ready. So we'll see how far we can get. Right. So first we'll speak about the construction of the p-adic function. Then I'll talk about how I've used it and built an API, and third, what we can get from this. Okay, so just a bit of preliminaries before we dive into it. A locally constant function is one whose pre-images for any set is an open set. And this is how it's defined in Lean. This is the bundled version. I think there is an unbundled version as well. Okay, and sorry, yeah, great. Okay, and I'm going to call this space of locally constant functions LC of xy, just notation. And all these functions are, of course, continuous. And a characteristic function is one which is one on a particular set and zero otherwise. More generally, you have the indicator function that does the same thing. But we use this often enough for me to make a particular definition of it. Because for Clopen sets, the characteristic function over the Clopen set is locally constant. Okay. Let me also tell you a bit about p-adic integers. Here are some equivalent definitions of p-adic integers. One is they are the completion of the integers with respect to the p-adic variation. So the mu p of any natural number n is the power of p dividing n. You can also think of it as all the elements of QP with p-adic form being less than or equal to 1. Or as the profinite completion of Z mod p power nz. And this is basically all the surjective maps from Zp to Z mod p power nz, taking any element A to A mod p power n. And a similar way to think of it is it's the set of all elements, summation ai p power I, where ai is in Z mod p power I. Okay. Here are some properties of Zp which are now in Mathlet. Zp is a compact Hausdorff and totally disconnected space. As a result of that, it has a topological basis of Clopen sets, which I should call UNA, and these are precisely the pre-image of any singleton element A in ZP under any of those surjective maps. And I'm going to denote any of the locally constant characteristic functions corresponding to these UNAs by chi-elements. And we then know that, well, it's not trivial, but we know that the set linearly spans the space of locally constant functions from ZP to A. Where A, I believe, is just a topological space with a monoid structure. So if you take any locally constant function f from ZP to A, you can find a natural number n such that for every n bigger than that n, f can be written as a finite sum of f of a small or mod chi n. And similarly, if you put in a Z mod dz, where D is co-prime to P, you can do the same thing because the space is finite and discrete. So everything works exactly the same. Okay, so what is a p-adic measure? To define a p-adic measure, we need to define a p-adic distribution, which is an A-linear map from the space of locally constant functions from X to A, where X is a profinite space and A is a non-linear. And the p-adic distribution is basically a bounded p-adic measure. Sorry, a p-adic measure is a bounded p-adic distribution. So you can find a k, a positive constant k, such that the norm of given distribution phi, the norm of phi of f is less than or equal to k times norm of f for every locally constant function f, then this is a p-adic measure. And the example that I worked with is the Bernoulli measure. So this is defined for all these characteristic functions psi and a as this thing, where C is a chosen natural number co-prime to D and to P. And these brackets over here are the fractional part. So this definition is originally in Q, but I have kept it as in QP. Because the rings we are going to work with are going to be QP algebras, so it's easier to define it over QP. Okay, so I want to tell you a bit about how we showed that this definition over here is actually a measure. It's clearly a distribution, but to make it a measure, first we need to define it on all locally constant functions. And to do that, you first extend it to the non-units by defining it to be zero wherever you have a non-unit. And we look at this particular sequence over here, summation f of a EC of chi na, which is basically EC of f. And once we prove that this is eventually constant, by which I mean that after a particular n, all the values are the same, then we will actually have that EC of f is the limit of all these GNs. And yes, so to do this, we use discrete quotients, because every locally constant function gives rise to a discrete quotient. And that discrete quotient is x is related to y if and only if f of x is equal to f of y. And this works well because we know that the preimage of any locally constant function is open. So we define another discrete quotient, which is x is related to y given an n if and only if x mod d is equal to y mod d and x mod p power n is equal to y mod p power n, where x and y are elements of z mod dz times zp. And this is essentially saying that they lie in the same preimage for a particular singleton, let's say A in z mod d times zp. Okay, so we get this definition, and then we prove that if you're given a locally constant function f, you can always find an n such that for all x and y satisfy this fn discrete quotient relation. Then x and y satisfy the discrete quotient relation for f. And as a result, this is equivalent to saying what we wanted to prove before. And so, so this is equivalent to saying what we wanted to prove before, which was that this term over here, this sequence is eventually constant. And another additional lemma that we need to do that is the following one here, which says that if you have x in z mod dp by nz and y in z mod dp by n plus 1z, then such that x is equal to y, such for all n greater than or equal to this number f, factor f that we got from here, then we must have f of x equal to f of y. That's by definition of the lemma. And how we do this is by defining the structure equiclass, which looks at all those x in z mod dp by nz such that they are equal in z mod dp by n plus 1z. So again, just pre-images over the 2z mod power surjective maps. And as a direct consequence of that, we get that this is the measure relation that we needed. EC of chi n plus 1a is equal to EC of chi n b. So that gives us a proof that the Bernoulli measure is actually a measure. Okay. So now that we have a measure, we can actually make a p-adic integral with respect to this measure. So if you look at any locally constant function f, and if you look at a measure mu, you can define integral f d mu to be evaluation at f. And since we've proved that the space of locally constant functions is dense in the space of continuous functions, where whenever x is profinite, this integral can be extended alinearly to the space of continuous functions. This is how it's defined in V. Yeah, and I believe all the prerequisites required to make this definition now exist in MATLAB. You do need A to be a complete space over here. Okay, so I'm going to take a small detour before we actually define p-adic functions in terms of p-adic integrals. I'll tell you a bit about Dirichlet characters. So Dirichlet characters are periodic multiplicative functions from z mod nz. And so it's said to have level n when it's a multiplicative function from z mod nz star to r star for some monoid r. And in fact, defining the level is somehow confusing, because when you define the level, you just say level is this value n. And so the linter gives you this remark that you don't actually need a Dirichlet character for this definition. But it does not exist without that. Okay, so similarly, one can define the associated Dirichlet character, which is called asso-Dirichlet character, which is 0 on the non-units, so you can make this a multiplicative function on z mod nz going to r. And the conductor is then the minimal period for this character. Yes, it's the minimal period for which a Dirichlet character is periodic. Note that generally Dirichlet characters are defined in terms of integers, but I think this was a little easier to work with, which is why I chose this definition. Then we have a primitive character. We say a character is primitive when the conductor is the same as the level. So for every Dirichlet character, you can have different levels at which it can exist. And the lowest level at which it can exist is called the associative primitive character. And yes, so if you've seen multiplication in Dirichlet characters, there are two ways to do this. If they have the same level, you can multiply them directly. But if they have different levels, then you can bring them to the same level, multiply them, and look at their associated primitive character. And that is what I call Dirichlet character of mul. This is a generalization of the canonical definition, because generally you can only multiply two primitive characters. So yes, and that's how it looks. So you have chi1 of level n, chi2 of level n, and the chi1 dot mul chi2 is the associated primitive character when you raise chi1 to the level of LCM of n and m times chi2 to the level of LCM of n and m. Okay. And the final detour, a little bit about Bernoulli numbers. So the Bernoulli numbers are originally defined as generating functions in this form, but we do have a closed form for them. And dependent on them, one can define the Bernoulli polynomials, which have this form. And they are interesting because they are used to evaluate sums of powers of natural numbers. But why we really need them is to use generalized Bernoulli numbers, because our p-adic functions take values in terms of these generalized Bernoulli numbers. So given a primitive Dirichlet character chi having conductor f, the generalized Bernoulli numbers are defined in the following form. And yes, this definition, by the way, is from Introduction to Cyclotomic Fields, written by Washington. Yes, so indeed, I have defined this. First of all, I have defined this to take values in any commutative semi-ring Q algebra S. So our Dirichlet character can be, and also our Dirichlet character need not be primitive. Because we simply take the associated primitive character instead. Yes, so this condition of S being a Q algebra, unfortunately, turns out to be a little hard to work with later on, but it's workable, so it's fine. Okay. So finally, coming to the definition of a p-adic function, we have first a Dirichlet L function that is defined as summation chi of n over n bar s for any Dirichlet character chi. This is known to be a meromorphic function with a pole at s equal to 1, and it extends these generalized Bernoulli numbers at negative integers. The p-adic functions do the same thing p-adically. So the Kubota-Leopold p-adic function is a meromorphic function which takes the values 1 minus chi omega pi minus n of p bar s times the Dirichlet function for negative integers 1 minus n. I'm sorry, the s over here should be 1 minus n. And omega is the Teichmuller character, which is the Dirichlet character of conductor P when P is odd. Okay, yes, so the Teichmuller character takes A to a unique P minus first root of unity that is congruent to A mod P. And interestingly, this definition over here was made using Witt vectors, which is pretty non-canonical and non-intuitive, but since these already existed and almost everything followed from it, it was easier to do it that way. Okay, so this is theorem 12.2 in Introduction to Cyclotomic Fields. You have a Dirichlet character chi. I'm not exactly sure if it is primitive or not, according to Washington. And some natural number n, which is non-negative. Then for S, a p-adic integer, and for a choice of C, which is co-prime to D and P, the following holds. So there were some complications when it came to defining the p-adic functions, because they are generally defined in CP, but CP did not exist in Lean at that point of time. So I instead chose this to be my definition, where I absorbed this -1 minus chi omega pi -1 minus s term into my definition. So there is an arbitrary choice of C, which is co-prime to D and P, that needs to be made. And this integral over here is the p-adic integral with respect to the Bernoulli measure. Right. So this is my alternate definition that at that time seemed the most appropriate. And in Lean, this is the definition. We have R to be a normed commutative ring, that is a normed QP algebra, which is non-trivial, a complete space, and a norm 1 class. And we also need D to be positive, and our integer, our natural number N to be positive. Yes, so this choice of C is arbitrary and can be whichever you like. Now this condition over here, NA, is essentially saying that R is non-Archimedean, but in a different form, because at that point of time, this is exactly what I needed and it was not there in me. So I just added it as an extra hypothesis. And initially, I had defined something called weight space, which was all these continuous monoid homomorphisms. However, recently I found that this already existed in me, so I'm using that instead. And the definition, as mentioned before, is the p-adic integral with respect to the Bernoulli measure, taking this value chi omega inverse of a bar s. Oh, sorry. So instead of the a bar s over here, we do this over any continuous monoid homomorphism W. And for this, the previous theorem to work, we need to take W to be omega bar s times a bar s. Yeah. And for this thing to be continuous, actually we need some properties of the units being continuous, and they're pretty long, so we'll not get into the details of that. Okay, so this is the construction of the p-adic function, and it took a long time to get here. And yeah, I'd like to tell you a bit about what I did after that, which was showing that this is exactly the definition we want. So now we want to show that at negative integers, the evaluation of this p-adic function is exactly this number here, in terms of the generalized Bernoulli number. Sorry, there's an extra negative over here that I should remove. So this is not a negative, it's a multiplication. And it also turns out that proving this will show that our definition, if we were to divide by this constant 1 minus chi omega bar minus n of c times c bar n, then we would get back the original definition of the p-adic function as defined by Washington. Yes. Yeah. So this is because there is no implication of our general ring R having division. So if it has division, then we can do this and verify that it's the same definition. And I've proved it for the case when chi is even and p is greater than 2. And the other cases, they follow similarly, but this in itself was 18,000 lines of code, so it will take a while to do all these cases. But all of them follow in the same way. And this is the theorem. I removed some excessive assumptions that we already saw. But apart from R being a QP algebra, we also needed to be a Q algebra and for it to have no zero divisors. And there is also an additional condition of the non-Archimedean kind, which is on the units, because we need to do sums over units and non-units. So I had to add in both the hypotheses. But both of these follow from the non-Archimedean condition. And then the theorem says that the p-adic function evaluated at net power prime, which is exactly the weight space element or the continuous monoid homomorphism we needed, is equal to 1 over n times 1 minus psi c times c power n, etc., etc. So that's the definition. Yeah. So instead of running through the theorems because they're very, very big, I thought instead I could tell you a bit about my observations. And yes, so the first thing I realized was that while dealing with limits, filter doc tends to, or filters in general, are much, much easier to work with than doing metric space calculations. So I wanted to show you an example, but I'm not exactly sure I can do it. I'll try. So basically, the point was that when you are working with metric space stuff, you have to do the given epsilon positive.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm resharing.
I see.
Right. Sorry, everything's not compiling at the moment, or it might in a second. Right. So as you can see, this is the general length of the lemmas involved. And deciphering them or even writing them is pretty hard. But what I wanted to show you was that I have 3 files devoted to doing this. Maybe it might be easier if I show you the proof first. Yes, so this is the theorem that we need to prove, and it's dependent on proving 3 things. Proving convergence of 3 sums. This is the first sum, this is the second sum, and this is the third sum. And the middle one is the most complicated one, as you can see in the proof over here. But the point I was trying to make, oh, sorry, my screen is not sharing. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. So this is the theorem that we wanted to prove, and it depends on proving the convergence of 3 sums. This is the first sum, this is the second sum, and this is the third sum. And the second one is the hardest and most complicated to evaluate, because the first one it's hard to prove, but it follows. The second one is also easy because it's 0, but the third one requires working with this int dot fract, or the fractional values, which is hard. As you can see, all these calculations are devoted to the second sum. Right. So what I was saying was, while doing these calculations, if you take an epsilon and if you continue working with these epsilons, then you need to say in the end that I need to look, there exists n condition which is there. That n turns out to be very complicated, because it might be something like, I don't know, x by chi omega inverse is something by something. And there were 6 to 7 such terms. which I could easily eradicate while working with the dot tends to. So I have 3 files devoted to this entire calculation. And after I ended up doing all these tends to calculations, I actually ended up putting it in this single file over here that is less than 300 lines long. So I think that is a very good start. Not only that, okay, I'm not sharing again. I don't know why. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, so I managed to put all the tends to I managed to put all the calculations in this file that is less than 300 lines long. Otherwise, it took me 3 files of each being around 300 to 400 lines long to make these calculations. So, as you can see over here, when you have these conditions given an epsilon, there exists an n such that for all x blah blah blah, then you prove that one condition works. You take classical dot sum of that, and then you need to look at the supremum or max of all these conditions, and there are 6 to 7 conditions. So the calculations really become very difficult to work with. And Lin arith or ring or sim do not solve these. So it's all hand work, which is very bad, very hard to work with. You know, these n1s, I had 6 n1 to n6, and then I had to look at the supremum of all of them and all of such conditions. And norm of these big sums is less than epsilon. So it tends to remove all of that. And also it tells you exactly where the non-Archimedean property is being used, because this non-Archimedean condition only comes in the places where tends to cannot work, because you really need to go down to the norm and then use the transitivity of less than equal to get it to get something like the supremum of something is less than epsilon, and then go further, which cannot be done with tends to arguments. So this was a very good way to know exactly where the non-Archimedean condition was needed. Okay. Sorry. So my second point was that yes. So the main proof, like I told you, was divided into 3 sums. The first sum was proved using something which is named lemma 7.11. And Washington mentions over there that this is proved only for even Dirichlet characters. But he does not mention any such thing while proving the main theorem. So his proof is not, it works only for even Dirichlet characters. Thankfully, lemma 7.11, a very similar method, works for all Dirichlet characters as well, which is good, but it does involve a lot of difficult calculations. Yes, and another difficulty I had was while working with Dirichlet characters, because suppose we have one Dirichlet character of level n, and suppose I have n equal to 0, then Lee does not identify the Dirichlet character to have level 0. So this gets pretty hard to deal with. And one way out was to work with equivalences instead, which is what I ended up doing. But then I end up having to use casts and equal to, which the lean documentation says you should not use that if you're writing correct code. But I don't think there's any other way to deal with this. So again, a lot of complicated things happen because of this. And like I showed you, the terms are pretty large with multiple coercions. of Z mod and p-adic and whatnot, that it's really hard to deal with. I thought one thing that might be helpful would be if we could have a tactic that deals with these coercions, which I believe would be difficult. And also if we could have a tactic that works with compositions, because at one point I had to compose 7 to 8 functions, and each of them had brackets in different places, and then the associativity of all of that is just very difficult to handle. Yes. So yeah, I think that's it. All this code is available on the p-adic branch, and if anyone working on or using p-adic integers or Dirichlet characters or the properties of Z mod NZ needs some properties, please ask me, because I have about 600 lines of code on that I shall slowly begin to PR to MATLAB. And thank you to the community, of course, for all the help. Thank you.
Let me switch this off.